Addicts are very creative. They are brilliant at what they get up to. There is just no stopping them. They're just very, very innovative, very creative. So the next speaker that we're going to listen to will be Dr. Palesa. She's a neurologist. Sometimes people drug and they don't realize what they do to their brains. Have you heard that a lot of people, sometimes after they've been drugging for years, they're schizophrenic, they're bipolar, they've got mental issues, and Dr. Palesa, as a neurologist, will share what these illicit drugs do to our brains. Thank you so much, Dr. Palesa, for coming from far. And she's got a small baby who is very attached and sorry. And so she's willing to give up her time to us. Thank you. Before we begin, can we bow our heads for a word of prayer? Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for the story of the bishops, for your deliverance, for your hand, for the grace that you continue to give to each and every one of us. We are thankful, dear Lord, for how you have made the brain, and as we discuss it, we pray for your wisdom, and we pray for your spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so this is the outline of our presentation. I usually like to put things into questions because I think if we can tap into our inquisitive mind, it makes us retain more. If I'm just bombarding you with a span of information, it doesn't really land anywhere. But if you know where we're going, then it makes it easier. So this is the map. Why does the brain matter? Why must I sit here and do a whole long presentation about the brain? What does the brain do? How do drugs get in the way of this? How can we prevent this, and how can we overcome? So that's basically the outline. It's 5 questions? Not too much, but as we get into it, you'll see there's way more. So why does the brain matter? So there are 3 verses up there, right? The first one is Deuteronomy 8, and it's, I believe, from verse 1, but actually going to verse 3, right? And this is God speaking to Moses, and, Moses saying what God said to him, right? And what God says to Moses is, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness to humble thee and to prove you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So the first verse says, you will remember all the way, right? And then it says, as you remember, then it will be that you will walk in the way of the Lord, right? So what God has designed, it's actually wonderful. The ability to remember. Have you ever thought about the fact that you don't have to think about what your name is? It's an automatic memory. You have a name, you've responded to that name. I didn't like my name for the longest time, but I'd still respond to it because it's mine, You have the ability to remember, and what God has blessed us with is memory. So that experience would teach us what things to do. So experience teaches you, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to burn, so you don't do it again. So God has given us memories so that we can, 1, remember how he's led us. Because once we remember how he's led us, then we will know what is in his heart, and also we will be more inclined to do his commandments. 1. But also, we will remember what happened when we didn't follow the Lord's leading. That's the reason why the whole Bible is so long. God really didn't need to take that long. It could have been 2 pages. I made the world. People didn't listen. I'm trying to bring them back. Please come back. Thanks. That's it. That's the summary. But he went through so many stories. Okay, and then there was this guy called Abraham. He listened to me until he didn't listen to me. Then he had a child. The child had to give up the child. There was conflict in his family. What God is trying to show us is we need to, 1, in our own experiences, remember how God has led us, but also in the experiences of others, how he has led us, and how, when we have deviated from his leading, what was the impact? Because then we will do his... So memory is a wonderful thing. It's great. Anyway, Proverbs 4, verse 23 says, out of the abundance of the... No, sorry. So it says the... Oh, now my memory is blanking out. You can see I didn't sleep. It says, Yes. No, so that's Matthew. It says, wow, yeah, the impact. Can somebody read Matthew 4, verse 23, the impact of lack of sleep? Proverbs 4, verse 23. Yes, keep your heart. Wow, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Yes. So keeping our heart in there, the word heart is actually, the word for the mind, right? So making sure that we keep our minds with all diligence, for out of it are the very issues of life. So how we maintain our minds, how we maintain our mental state will determine how we live life. Think about what you have done when you've had a bad day. None of us ever mean to shout at a spouse, to speak hurtful things, but you had a bad day, you're stuck in traffic for long, you're really tired, you didn't sleep, it's the third time the dishes haven't been washed, that whole thing, and you snap, right? It's because the mental state was not in its greatest form, and therefore you ended up doing something. So if we keep our minds out of it, are all of the issues of life, right? And then Romans 12, verse 1 to 2, tells us that we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. So the act of transformation has its seed in how my mind and my brain works. So God saves us through the mechanisms of our mind. That's the only thing that's the only way he can, right? Because we have to choose to follow him. And so therefore he makes us remember things. He makes us realize how important the mind is. But that's the way that he is actually going to reach you and me. How you stop doing things. Brother Randall was just saying that it didn't matter how, at some point in his experience, how much you would have tried to bring him out, up until in his mind, the decision had been made, right? So similarly, God's mechanism of saving us is the mind. Now, there's this wonderful quote from the book, The Great Controversy. If you have not read this book, I really recommend it. I'm sure Auntie Connie can organize copies. It's really a great, great book, right? It says, Satan invents unnumbered schemes to occupy minds that they may not dwell upon the very work which we ought to be acquainted, right? The arch deceiver hates the great truths that bring to view an atoning sacrifice and an all-powerful mediator. He knows that with him, everything depends on his diverting the mind of Jesus and his truth. Now, although it may seem like we're speaking about separate things throughout these presentations, we're speaking about the same thing. What the previous speakers were speaking about, the addiction to the internet, what Anka was speaking about, all of it is a diversion from the great truths that are meant to occupy our attention. So Satan knows if he can move our minds from a state of fixating, from remembering the way that the Lord has led us all of our lives, but also if he can get our minds to be in such a way that these truths will not impact us, then he has us, right? Truth can only impact us if it has our attention. Things can only impact us if they have our attention. You won't believe how many doctors smoke. Why? Because only when I'm counseling you, telling you your lungs are out, is that truth actually in my mind holding my attention. But when I'm outside smoking something, it's not holding my attention. So truth can actually only save us when it has our attention. So Satan's desire is to move our attention away, right? Okay, so in summary, why does the brain matter? The brain is the seat of memory. And memory is the tool that God desires to use to teach us about him, right? It houses our personality, your God-given quirks. And, we may have very similar personalities. Those personality tests, you're a ENTJ, I don't even know them. But no two people actually have the same personality because no two people have gone through the same life experiences. I may be more outgoing, but I actually don't really enjoy speaking to people much. So although I'm an extrovert, I suck at small talk. Those slight quirks, which may have been impacted by my own experiences, houses your personality. And mind you, God wants to save each and every one of us as individuals. When you look at how the high priest was dressed in the sanctuary, he had the ephod that had the 12 stones, and each of those 12 stones had the names of each of the children of Israel, showing that God bears each and every one of us so personally. So our personality is really important to God, right? It's the area of our decision making. And like we said earlier, it is where sanctification takes place, right? This is another quotation from a book. It's 2 volumes of the Book of Redemption. It says, the brain is the capital of the body. If the perception or the perceptive faculties become benumbed through intemperance of any kind, eternal things cannot be discerned. So basically, if we look at if life was a big chess game, its first move is to give us memory and a great brain. Satan's next move is to try to impact that. We're together. Cool. So now let's look at the general structure of the brain. I'm not going to go through it. You guys aren't writing my exam with me. That's not how deep we're going to go. But I just want us to see just the overall structure, because that will help us to understand what some of the drugs do, right? So in the pink red there, we have the frontal lobe, right? Now this is the king of the brain, right? In the very, very front of the frontal lobe is our orbital frontal cortex, which is where our personality is housed and which is where our decision making happens, right? This houses inhibition. So when we get to a certain age, we realize that some things are a bit inappropriate to do, right? You know, my kid can come to you now and point at your nose and say you have snot in it, you know? I'm not going to do that. I can have a 30-minute conversation, but I'm not going to do that, right? Because I have learned that certain things are appropriate and certain things are inappropriate. So what often happens with people that have lost their frontal lobe function, we even see them in ward rounds. We'll be standing, and you know, in those ward rounds, patient is sitting in the bed, there are like 12 of us surrounding, and you know that it seems to be a serious situation because there are people, they're talking about you, and we even explain, we're not speaking just about you, we're speaking about just your condition, and they'll go, that's a nice pen. That guy's fat. Like that's literally the level of disinhibition that happens once you've lost your frontal lobe abilities, right? You can urinate anywhere, you can defecate anywhere, because that appropriateness filter has been removed, right? So once that is gone, it's very difficult to kind of regain that function, right? You basically have to relearn appropriateness. You have to relearn that certain things cannot be said all the time. A friend of mine was telling a story that at a church, there was a gentleman who had some kind of mental illness, and he stood up to do a testimony. Now, anyone that has spoken to him in the past 3 weeks, knew not to let him go up. But you know, it's church, man. Come up. It was after communion service. And he went and told everyone's sin. That guy, I see him on a Friday where I used to drink. That guy, like, literally went, you know, full force. He's like, you guys think you're ready, you're not. But the level of appropriateness had basically been filtered out. Cool. So, up there in the yellow is our parietal lobe. Now, mind you, these are crude, gross functions. There's interconnectedness with all of them, right? So, with all of them, there's a bit of overlap in function. It also depends on if it's the right side of the brain or the left side of the brain. But basically, overall, our parietal lobe gives us sensory interpretation, right? So what you feel in your nerves in your hands is actually interpreted in your brain. It tells you, is it sharp? Is it hot? If you close your eyes and put an object in your hand, you will know that this is a set of car keys. You'll know that this is a rubber ball. Once you've lost your parietal lobe function, you can actually even lose that. So I will put a set of car keys in your hand and you'll say, no. It's a jiggly thing. This is our right, left. So we actually don't know. We only know because of the brain that our self belongs to us. So that this hand is mine and that this hand is mine is basically a function of the parietal lobe. So in loss of parietal lobe, you can actually get what is called hemi-neglect. You can lose that capability to know that that side is yours in a severe form. So in a mild form, you basically, if people are touching you on both sides, you wouldn't recognize that they're touching the other side. You just recognize only one side. In a severe form, there's a neuroscientist, Oliver Sacks, who wrote this book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And in the book, he tells a story of this lady that they just kept finding on the floor. And they didn't understand, Mrs. Solomon is on the floor. Every morning, Mrs. Solomon is on the floor. So they decided to watch her in the middle of the night. And at around 2 a.m., she woke up. took her leg that was now weak and threw it out of the bed, and then she fell. So they come to her and they ask Mrs. Solomon, why? What happened? She says, it's the most bizarre thing. Every morning at around 2 a.m., I wake up and I find this person's leg in the bed. So she had lost that identity of the fact that this part of her leg actually belonged, or this part of her body actually belonged to her. Right. Okay, at the back in the blue, we have our occipital lobe. So this is what processes what comes through our eyes. So we have light and stuff coming through our eyes, and our occipital lobe makes sense of it all. So in severe lesions, you can develop what's called cortical blindness. So your eyes and stuff is still fine, but you literally cannot see. But in less severe forms, you can get more cool things. You can get like what's called an Anton syndrome. You are blind, but you actually don't realize that you're blind. You can get a kind of blindness where if objects move, you're able to see them, but you aren't able to see them stationary. It's, interesting. Green over there is basically our temporal lobe where auditory interpretation takes place, right? Not just auditory, we'll see that it does more if you cut. But for the most part, what we hear also underneath in the deeper structures are memory, which is where we're going to go now. Oh, at the back, before I forget it, at the back is the tiny brain, literally translated, cerebellum. So what the cerebellum does is basically to coordinate movements. So when you move your hand to take a bottle, your frontal and parietal lobes are working to get you to move your hand to go forward. But they basically do it in a very crude way. It's like, so what your cerebellum does is to refine that. Have you seen how a newborn or let's say a 3-month-old reaches to touch your nose and it's just clumsy, right? So their cerebellum function is quite primitive. So as they grow older, then you gain the ability to fine-tune your movements. It's the reason why babies walk broad-based and their cerebellum function is still coming through, but once they get the hang of it, then the gait improves, right? Cool. Now, if we cut through half like this, right? So cutting like this is more of the brain. So in the purple underneath, right, you'll see what's called the limbic lobe, which is mostly in charge of memory. So the hippocampal formation basically just codes our memory. It's pretty cool, but you have different kinds of memory. You have your long-term memory, your short-term memory, forming new memories. You have your semantic memory, you have historical memory. So all of that is stored there, right? If you notice, right, where that purple is close to that thing that kind of looks a little bit like a bird cut in half, right? And that around there is also where our fight-flight responses happen, and this is why our memories are also linked to stuff. The other thing that the temporal lobe does is to interpret smells, etc. So that's why even our memories are also really linked to, you can smell something and it will take you back, to way back when. Okay, and then, that's basically all I wanted to go through for that. Then at the bottom there, you can see where our homeostatic control happens. So basically, this area of our brain helps to secrete certain hormones to control everything. So this is why you can see that the brain is the king of organs. It does everything, literally everything. All right, now, other thing about how the brain works is the brain tells signals through neurotransmitters. So actually, what's happening in your mind is it's just an ESCOM power station. There's a lot of electricity, right? Like electrical connections, it never goes out, thank God. But it's basically just electrical connections happening throughout, right? But those electrical connections, you can't live wire to live wire. So you need to basically connect those two sections in a different way. So God in his wisdom designed these things called neurotransmitters. I really, sometimes when I think about the fact that God made Adam out of clay, I don't know how these things were. This is a speck of dust, I don't know. But anyway, so basically from one end of an axon, which is a nerve cell, to another, there are these terminals, right? And these terminals hold pockets of substances called neurotransmitters. So this is how the electrical signal becomes converted into a chemical signal to go from this nerve to another nerve. So from, let's say I'm seeing something, but I need to go forward. Our visual centers are at the back. Our motion centers are way back in the front. So I need to connect those, right? So there are connections that are running to and fro, and then these neurotransmitters become secreted, and then I know what I'm seeing I must also avoid this table in order for me to move forward, right? So they transform electrical signals to chemical signals, and there are different kinds, right? So there are excitatory neurotransmitters. So these basically promote an action happening or promote the waking up of the next cell, right? So instead of the other cell calming down, the next cell would also basically now send another signal. Then there are inhibitory ones, because you also don't want everything to be going on all the time. There are times where you need to say, this part needs to switch off in order for that part to function. So there are some that are inhibitory, and there are some that modulate. So they'll calm down this aspect, wake up that aspect. You get the situation. So they're the modulators, right? Now, what drugs do is, for the most part, they act on these neurotransmitters and where these neurotransmitters bind. Because so imagine a lock and a key. The neurotransmitter itself, the substance itself, is the key. But it must fit into a lock, right? Now, if something else clones the key and fits into the lock but does not move out, you have issues, right? So drugs basically do that. They bind to the places where the neurotransmitters are meant to go in the most part, or they activate parts of the brain in different ways. It depends on the kind of drug, right? Okay, so this drug is a common one that has basically become more acceptable, right? Alcohol. So what does alcohol do? Alcohol is a promoter of one of the most inhibitory neurotransmitters, which is called GABA. So it promotes GABA. So it basically promotes inhibition, right? Or inhibition of your nerve cells. So this is why after people drink a lot, they fall asleep or all of that, because it's basically trying to quieten down the nervous system. But it also inhibits your excitatory neurotransmitters, right? So overall, the net effect is that you'll calm down. But over time, what ends up happening is you have a change in how many of your neurotransmitters you have. So imagine you've been switching off the lights all the time. Eventually, no one's going to switch them back on because you realize there's no point, right? Either that, or your body actually ends up developing more because it's realizing there's a loss of function. Maybe there's something wrong with these neurotransmitters or these places, these binding sites that we had put out. So let's make more so that there are more places to bind. But what that leads to is that you're more sensitive to stuff, right? And what that ultimately ends up happening is that you have an increased sensitivity to your excitatory neurotransmitters. So when people actually go through withdrawal, what we see this in festive season all the time, you never know what's seizures and you never know what's alcohol withdrawal. Yeah. So you basically have to do the sniff test where you smell what the person smells like to see it. But basically within the first 12 to 48 hours of an alcohol binge, if you've been binging like that for quite some time, after a while, your body gets used to, remember, it's now up-regulating the one, down-regulating the other, and you get so sensitive to it that any small excitation develops a major issue, and then you get alcohol withdrawal seizures, right? And hallucinations, it's called DT. So patients will either develop hallucinations alone or will develop hallucinations with the sweating and sickness and the shaking. We've seen it was then, the shaking and the tremors and all of that. Withdrawal from that. Then you can get, over a short period of time, what's called the Wernicke's encephalopathy. So here you have some eye signs that are a bit abnormal. You have some unsteadiness and you have confusion. Now, what alcohol works on the most, I'm going to go back to our picture. That little brain, the coordination, the cerebellum, that's where alcohol does the most of its effects. Now, although it does it everywhere, but that's where, so somebody with cerebellar dysfunction actually looks like somebody who's drunk. They slur their words, they're a bit unsteady, but in actual fact, it's because of cerebellar dysfunction. But alcohol over time can actually reduce the size of your cerebellum itself and give you prolonged effects. So you look like you're drunk even though you're not. Like 5-10 years later, you look like you're permanently in a drunk state. Can improve with alcohol, with stopping, but sometimes it doesn't improve completely. So there was a patient who came and said, please can you speak to my family and tell them I'm not drinking anymore. I know I still sound drunk, but I promise you I'm not drinking anymore. And it's just because the cerebellum has taken a hit, right? So the Wernicke's encephalopathy is also linked to B1 or thiamine deficiency. So when people take alcohol binges, because alcohol is high in calories, they don't actually get hungry. So they end up not taking in nutritious food, and then they develop a thiamine deficiency, and over time it can cause this Wernicke's encephalopathy. But if that now goes on even longer, it can cause something that's called a Korsakoff dementia. So Korsakoff's dementia is that the people actually develop proper amnesia. They are unable to lay down new memories. So their brain is able to remember up until 2019, and going forth, they cannot lay down any new memories. So it's almost like the brain function stops at 2019, right? This is also associated with some apathy and just general brain changes. There's also a reduced amount of nerve cells in the frontal lobe. Now, remember, we said our frontal lobe is the king of our decision making. So you have less of these cells in your frontal lobe. And this is why alcoholics are not the most inhibited people. You know, when somebody is drunk, you can't ask them to do a lot of things, but they can ask you to do many things. Why? Because they have a lot of inhibition, right? Yeah, and we spoke about the cerebellar dysfunction. The next one that I did not know was as common until I started working. A lot of people are using cocaine. It's actually scary. It's pretty scary, especially in the corporate world. I did not realize how many people are using cocaine. Okay, so cocaine, right? So one of the main things is cocaine it activates part of our nervous system called our fight or flight response, right? Our autonomic nervous system. It puts you in fight, right? Now, what this happens is that what this causes is that it causes closing up of your blood vessels, right? So closing up of your blood vessels in your heart, closing up of your blood vessels in your brain. Heart attack, brain, stroke, right? Stroke or bleed. Now, stroke or bleed, both of them are strokes, but infarct, so basically a clot in the brain. So you've closed off the vessel, and you end up developing sluggish flow, and then you develop a clot there, right? So that's our typical stroke. But you can close off the vessel, and remember, now it's put you in fight response. So it's increased your blood pressure hectically and your heart rate hectically. So what happens is that you're having a lot of pressure through this closed vessel. So it pops. And that's actually a more catastrophic one, because bleeds are very difficult. You can't really get them, right? There was when I was still in med school, I think it was like 22 or something, came with his mom, and the mom was so concerned. His heart, she was saying, no, he's not looking all right, I don't know, he came back home and he was just sweating, and I think he ate something bad. So I'm like, okay, can I ask him what happened? She's like, yeah, sure, you can ask him. I'm like, can I ask him without you? So already she's offended, because, how dare? So I asked him, he's like, yeah, no, look, I took quite a bit of cocaine today. His blood pressure was high. It was like in the 180s. It was very high. Thankfully, he didn't stroke, but he did have early changes of like a heart attack. Yeah. Then the dopamine reward pathway. So most of these drugs actually do this. Even the alcohol does this. God had designed us for pleasure, right? And in the design for pleasure, life would be really boring if you didn't eat something nice and it tasted nice and there wasn't some satisfaction. That's the way God designed it. But God designed that these pleasure centers be ruled by our reasoning capabilities. So I know that cocaine would give me pleasure, but my frontal lobe tells me that is not the way to get it. Rather go eat an apple, However, what happens with these drugs is that you have an overactivation of this dopamine reward pathway. So you feel this flood, the euphoria, and then when you start coming down, in order to experience the high, you have to do more and more, or something stronger, or something different, or something, more, right? And this is actually ultimately what leads to addiction. But the other thing is that with this dopamine reward pathway is that you do anything in order to experience the euphoria. And this is why that, combined with the frontal lobe removal, is the reason why, as Ms. Bishop was describing, the selling of things, it's not good, but you know that the reward is now the king. If I can just get that reward, that is what's premium, and everything else is secondary. So it's an overtaking of the system as God had designed it. The frontal lobe is now no longer in charge. It's just the reward that's in charge. It's like leaving cake in front of a child, They'll eat, vomit, eat. It doesn't matter because there's no longer any stop sign, right? It is linked to anxiety and psychosis. So substance-induced psychotic disorder is actually very prevalent in our community. It is psychosis, so it's like schizophrenia, but the source of it is actually from substance use. Most of the patients in the psych wards have that. So when you ask the drug history, they'll tell you that they used some either cocaine, methamphetamines, so wunga, or weed. So there may be a bit of a genetic predilection, but because you've messed around with the chemicals in the brain over a while, the brain just locks into that state, right? And then it may be linked to Parkinsonism. So this is not Parkinson's itself, but you basically behave like a person with Parkinson's. The shaking, the rigidity, the slowness, this may have to do with the dopamine overactivation, because that's actually what happens with Parkinson's. It's a down regulation. But yeah, over time, because you've regulated this pathway so much, you've lost some of your dopamine receptors, and then you can develop something that looks like Parkinson's. It's also linked to the psychosis, because what we give is we give drugs that have dopamine in them or prevent dopamine in order to facilitate the lack of psychosis, right? So the combination of the two. Yeah. The next one, I don't know if that's, nicotine. Another one that is really more common. Now, what I appreciated from Anka's presentation was, Satan Shem, with cell phones, I must give him 10 marks, 10 out of 10. Cell phones and social media invention has really made his job easier. 10 years ago, I didn't know what drugs they were doing in China. You didn't know how they got high in Pakistan. We didn't know. But now, because of social media and the connectivity between places, you know that, hey man, that side there. And if your brain is already in a state of seeking a high, you can easily combine stuff. Not only that, but certain things have been made to look cool and acceptable. On every Instagram feed of people that are having fun is a hookah pipe or a cigarette or a vape. I mean, how many people we didn't know about vape. We already knew about it because people were doing those vaping challenges where they're blowing things into, the bubbles into. Why? Because of that interconnectivity. He really doesn't have to do that much to tempt anymore. Before it had to come with a ship, but now we seek it ourselves, right? So nicotine has become way more acceptable in our society, but it's really bad. It's really more commonly used. I mean, when I was in primary school, that was my first exposure to hookah pipe. I didn't even I thought it was just water. That's how dumb you are. I thought it was just bubbling water, and then there were flavors. So I'm like, okay, so you guys are putting cool drink in water and sniffing it. Pretty weird, but okay. Then only later did I find out actually it was nicotine and tobacco in the thing. But basically it binds to our receptors, similar thing as acetylcholine receptors. Over time, it can create brain volume loss, right? Mood disorder. So this is your anxiety, depression, bipolar mood disorder, especially if you have a proclivity to it. So if you have a family history, if you have all of that, it lowers your impulse control. Now remember, when we were in school, they used to call these the gateway drugs, because you get your system used to experiencing an unnatural feeling. You can't get the feeling from eating a slice of cake. It's nice, but it doesn't do that wooziness, that feeling that I got from smoking a cigarette or vaping. So that then puts you at a greater predisposition to seek something else, because I have never experienced that before. And therefore, so it's a legal drug, but it's a drug nonetheless, and it puts you in a seeking position. There are very few people in the psych ward that will tell you they smoked only mandrax and didn't smoke cigarettes, or they smoked only tik and didn't smoke cigarettes. You usually do them all together. And in the psych ward, actually, man, the smoking prevalence there is quite bad. You see them walking in a line, a single file, going outside, being allowed to take a smoke or to go by, or because of the fact that their system has gotten so used to an unnatural feeling that they need that feeling or some kind of feeling consistently. So you can't get used to just feeling bored and nothing, and a normal brain, you need something, right? Also, at higher volumes, you can develop seizures. Remember, it's activating a pathway, a neurotransmitter, that is one of the main neurotransmitters. So if you, in high volumes, you can actually develop seizures. And they've seen this especially with younger kids that try vaping, because the percentage of nicotine in vape is actually higher than in a cigarette. So the kids take the vape, but the kid is this big, and then comes with seizures, and then, yeah. And strokes. So the stroke thing is linked to the effect on the blood cells in the brain, or the blood clots, or the blood aura. Now my English is going into Afrikaans. Blood vessels in the brain. I started speaking Afrikaans before I spoke English, so it just shows sometimes. So the blood vessels in the brain get this chronic damage, right? This chronic damage, and that chronic damage puts you at risk for, so basically that combined with other things, puts you at risk for an over-inflammation basically in that blood vessel. And once you have that over-inflammation in that blood vessel, other cells come to kind of calm down the situation, but that's closing up the blood vessel even more. You close it until eventually it's closed completely. Stroke. Yeah. 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 I didn't put a name for this one. So basically, they are the main thing in marijuana is this THC, right? Tetrahydrocarbon. So or cannabinoid. So it binds to this cannabinoid receptors that are in our brain already. And then this affects our hippocampal formation. So remember I said the hippocampal was in charge of memory. Messes with that whole memory cascade. You develop a loss of your memory. That is then thought to be the underlying mechanism by which people start to develop the substance-induced psychotic disorder. Then it can also create, once again, the dopamine high and the addiction. So you feel the dopamine high, the pleasure, and then you're stuck in it until, once again, also a gateway drug. You want more. And then it can also cause impaired coordination, especially very acutely. You know, we had, this is very funny, we had a patient come in this week and we couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. She came in and she said she just feels really bad. She couldn't walk well. She was unsure about why she couldn't walk well. Like, it just happened suddenly. So do a scan of her brain, and the scan of her brain showed an old stroke, but we didn't understand why. Now acutely she has stuff, you know, just in coordination, but she's also looking unwell. So the next day we get to her and she's fine, man. She's 100%. So then her boss came and said he had a confession to make. He realized that she ate some of his sweets. So initially all of us are like, okay, sweets. And then he's like, no, sweet. Then we realized edibles. She had never tried anything else. She felt horrible. She felt sick. So now that combined with the old stroke made us think it was something new. She didn't even know she had previously had a stroke, right? So we just saw the changes. But because of her incoordination, her weakness looked more exaggerated, basically. Of note, right? So some of the things that I'm speaking about are mostly in the brain itself. But that's not just the only thing. Remember, there's the entire rest of the body. There's the other part of the nervous system. So these effects are, yes, isolated to the brain, but it does way more. Not just that, but there's the psychosocial effects. All of those things are, real impacts, right? For example, the alcohol, what I didn't mention was that alcohol can give you a toxic neuropathy. So it can give you an actual nerve defect in your legs. You know, like how the old diabetic people long ago used to get their feet cut off because they'd get hurt. So it kills the nerves in your feet over time. Recently had a 25-year-old admitted and she couldn't walk, right? So we're asking what happened. She's just like, no, man, it happened. I can't remember over how many days. When we eventually get into her drug history, she says, no, she's been drinking these sachets. I had never heard of it, right? So they are sachets. I think she said they cost 5 rand, but it's concentrated brandy. Yeah. I don't know if she drank it straight. I don't know. But she's like, no, they get them from the Nigerian shops, and it's a very high percentage of alcohol. I really just can't remember how much. But within a year of drinking it, I mean, her nerves were out. Like, out. Thankfully, she started regaining some function, but she still looks a bit funny, right? So nerve damage is real. There's a family, 2 families actually, that have within the family. So first we thought it was some inherited situation because you're seeing 3 sisters together. What's happening? Until they told us that actually also couldn't walk, weird gait, nerves shot in the legs. When we found out, actually, they used to take benzene together. They used to sniff benzene together and it messed with their nerves. There's one where the mother and the daughters was taking benzene together. We also thought it was some inherited situation. No, couldn't walk because of benzene toxicity to the nerves themselves. So it's just a reminder that although we're dealing with the brain, there's way more that it can do. All of the things can do, right? You can't really see that, but these are opioids. So morphine and morphine's friends and cousins. This is more of an American crisis, in all honesty. They have a real opioid crisis. In South Africa, not so much. It's not our flavor. We find the opioids more in drugs that are mixed with stuff, but it's not really our thing. But basically, also similar thing. It triggers the dopamine situation. Your limbic system, or where your memory is stored, is affected. You have this imbalance of dopamine once again. It's also a central nervous system depressant. So it, like alcohol, makes you come all the way down, right? It brings pain, but it also induces the drowsiness and the lethargy and the, and you have the impaired decision-making and white matter reduction. Now, similarly, Mandrax actually performs similarly. It actually is an opioid. Similarly. So it creates that central nervous system depression. Strangely, at my grandmother's house, where I would spend the holidays, my grandmother would always tell us not to sit with the guys that are playing dice outside. But they were nice. So my brother would sit with them, and then randomly they'd just start doing Mandrax. It was very strange, but you'd see that the high has been hit when they just started like drooling completely and looked like, just out, like lapops with their heads that are, But because of this impaired decision making, there was a lot of child molestation in that, especially with those guys. And now retrospectively, I realized when my grandmother didn't want my brother, especially messing with those guys, we just thought it was, okay. But what would often happen is they'd say, no, let's take the dice session to whoever's house. And that's where a lot of we actually also knew about the child molestation, but it wasn't, in a child's head, you're like, yeah, those guys touch people, but we didn't understand what that fully meant. So the Mandrax situation and the impaired decision-making is really because of that central nervous system depressant effect, right? So this is the one that's, hey, as our communities, look, I did my studying in Cape Town, but methamphetamines it's horrible within our community, right? So once again, the dopamine situation creates that high, that addiction, the impulse control, but it's also a central nervous system stimulant. So there's a guy who my brother was taking the train from Cape Town to Joburg. And he was saying, no, he doesn't want his things to be stolen. He must be awake the whole time. The brother's like, just relax, just sit on your stuff. He's like, no. Must be awake. You must be awake. That's why I'm going to take the. And the man did not sleep. And they even had a song that they were chanting with his friends in the thing about being khatak the whole time. But you literally will not sleep because it creates a hyper arousal. So a hyper alert state, but also a hyper arousal state, like a sexual arousal state that is like intense. So that's why a lot of the people end up molesting people or raping people because of that hyper arousal state and that impaired decision making, right? Then also, because it's also activating your fight or flight response, it does the similar thing to cocaine, the clogging up the closing up of blood vessels, increasing the blood pressure. So in Cape Town, we had a lot of young strokes, like 20-year-old stroke bleed into the brain because of the amount of methamphetamine use. The interesting thing about methamphetamine use in South Africa is that we don't have many pure methamphetamines. We have mixes. And the mixes vary according to the location. You'll find there was some that were saying they use a certain type of ARV with the methamphetamine powder, with other things, with Grand Power, with just mix. Then there's some that was stealing people's TVs because apparently there was a powder inside. Yeah, right? So it's a different mix, and this is what makes it even more dangerous. We never know the mix. We never know the formulation. It's not like a tablet where you know this is 20% this, 10% that. Just the mix. And it depends on who's mixing. They put in baby powder, dishwashing liquid, just anything. Any kind of powdery form or substance that they can find. So we never know that. And that's why it's also difficult to track fully what it's doing in the brain and where, right? Yeah. Ecstasy, right? Yeah. So this one binds to our serotonin transporter. So if we know, a lot of our antidepressants have or create a change in our serotonin levels, right? This kind of does the same thing, but at a hectic level, right? So it has both stimulants, so similar to your methamphetamine and cocaine, but also hallucinogenic properties. So you'll see things, right? And then your serotonin also stimulates your fight or flight response, which gives you the same thing of increased heart rate, closing off of your lumens, and then ultimately can also lead to stroke. And then you also have that impaired memory and cognitive impairment, as well as the depression apparently in this one is actually possibly one of the worst, right? Okay, so that was a whole lot, but crux of it all is they do different things, but they do damage, right? So what can we do? Now, if you're starting at a position where you've never start. It's really not necessary. It's not an essential in life. You won't lose anything from not vaping and making bubbles. You won't lose anything from not smoking. It's easier to never start. On your life, on yourself, on your family, on everything. It's just easier to never start because the recovery is difficult, right? Seek help appropriately, of course. And this is where, we as a church can try to do more. Recovery centers, even stop smoking campaigns are really not as common in the Adventist church here as I feel like they should be. I feel like every community should at least have some kind of a stop smoking center or stuff to help people, especially because this is the most common thing that we're seeing, but it creates quite debilitating effects. Then the good thing is that there are Bible promises, right? Philippians 4 verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And Romans 8, if I ever preach and there's no Romans 8, just know I wasn't done with the sermon, right? But it says there's no condemnation to those that are in Christ Jesus, right? For what the law could not do, and this is my favorite part, this is verse 3. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak in the flesh, God sending his only Son in the likeness of sin and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of Christ might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. So, when we read Romans 7, it gives us a dismal picture. It's actually the picture of an addict. He wants to do good, can't do good. It's the picture of any sinner, actually. Addiction is just sin taken to its most intense and logical consequence, right? But we're all trapped in some way, shape, or form by this virus of sin. And ultimately, Paul cries out, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death?" But he answers himself in that verse to say, there really is no condemnation. What our nature, in its inherent weakness and its tendency towards sin, struggles to do, God sending his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, for the sake of our sin, is able to, one, condemn sin in the flesh, but also to enable us to walk in the Spirit. So that toppling over of the lower powers or the driving forces of pleasure that are now controlling, our cognitive and our decision making, God is able to reverse that to the uttermost completely. He's able to make us beings that will actually ultimately deny those pleasure-seeking things and seek after him and find pleasure in that. That's what the book of Psalms tells us, that in your right hand are pleasures evermore. That would be the source and the zenith of pleasure. And that's what God wants us to experience. And he alone can help us. So if ever there's someone, let us try to point them to Jesus. I know sometimes, it's difficult to do so because one is not ready to to receive. There's an analogy of, a fruit tree, and it says oftentimes we do more damage by trying to pick unripe fruits. But what we can do is to water the seed. We can be loving and lovable Christians until ultimately one is able to see Christ in us and to try to follow after the steps of Jesus. And then for us, for each and every one of us, let us really, really hold on to the hand of Christ to enable us to keep from falling and to present us faultless before his throne. Amen.